After Grace and Malik's secret affair became known, their life, once hidden behind a mask of illusions, fell apart before our eyes. The moment the truth came out, the consequences of their actions became irreversible. Each of them had lost more than they could have imagined, and now they both had to learn to live in a world that they had destroyed themselves. Grace, being a woman accustomed to stability and respect in her family and society, felt her world crack at the seams. She lost the trust of her husband, George, who left home when he found out about her infidelity. Their daughter, Erica, was heartbroken and could no longer communicate with her mother, considering her a traitor. Grace felt isolated, being in a house that had once been full of joy and love. The silence of this house now began to weigh on her like a heavy weight. Every corner reminded her of what she had lost, and the mirrors reflected the insecurity and shame that were growing in her soul. Malik, on the other hand, was also on edge. His life with Erica, their plans for the future, everything was destroyed in an instant. Erica filed for divorce, and Malik found himself alone, living in an empty apartment that was no longer filled with her presence. He realized that he had betrayed his wife, the one who believed in him the most, and now he had to live with this burden every day. Malik, being a man accustomed to confidence and stability, now could not find support. It seemed to him that his future was irretrievably lost, and guilt consumed him every day. Their meeting after the exposure was not a relief for either of them. Both found themselves in the grip of disappointment and regret.
Malik, I do not know how we got to this point. I just don't understand how everything could collapse so quickly. We were just trying to feel something real, weren't we?
Grace stood in front of him, her voice brittle, almost brittle, as if she was struggling with inner demons, realizing that she couldn't change what had already happened. She couldn't look at Malik with the warmth she had once seen him with. Now they were connected only by a sense of common defeat and pain.
I ask myself the same question every day. It was wrong from the beginning, and we both knew it. But why didn't we stop? Why did you let it go so far?
His voice was full of bitterness, and there was a sense of fatigue in it. He tried to find answers, but each time he returned to the same thing, they both became hostages of their emotions and weaknesses. Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes again. She tried to suppress them, but the pain was too much. Their bond, which had once seemed so strong and even exciting to them, was now only a source of torment.
I've ruined my life, Malik. George hates me. Erica doesn't even want to talk to me. I've lost everything that mattered.
She covered her face with her hands, tears rolling down her cheeks. These were not only tears of disappointment, but also the realization that there is no way back. Malik came closer. He wanted to comfort her, but his own hands were shaking. He understood that he had also destroyed everything he had.
I lost Erica. She left me, and I can't blame her. I ask myself every day, how could I do this to her? But now it's too late to change anything. We both ruined our lives.
There was a heavy silence in the air. They no longer knew what to say to each other. Their words seemed empty, as did their feelings. The romance that had once seemed real and strong to them was now hidden under mountains of guilt and regret. Every day their communication became more strained. They met to discuss the consequences of their actions, but each time this communication turned into an exchange of accusations and self-accusations.
What now, Malik? What should we do? I can't keep living with this guilt. We have to fix this somehow.
Her voice was full of despair, as if she was still hoping for an opportunity to fix something that was already irreparable. But her gaze at Malik was full of pain.
I do not know how to fix this, Grace. We made a mistake that cannot be fixed. We have lost those we loved. Maybe the best thing we can do now is just stop communicating.
His words sounded like a sentence. They both understood that their affair had not only ruined their own lives, but also the lives of those who were dear to them. Now they were bound only by a common guilt. Grace nodded, knowing he was right. Their connection, which once seemed significant, became a poison that poisoned everything they had. Her heart was broken, but she couldn't continue this cycle of suffering. She wanted to break out of this circle, but she didn't know how. With each passing day, the tension between them increased. They tried to avoid each other, but the realization of their mistake haunted them constantly. Grace, being more emotionally open, suffered more from this breakup. She could not forget what she had done, and every day seemed to her an endless torment. Malik, on the other hand, was trying to deal with his condition somehow. He began to work more, trying to forget about mistakes, plunging into a routine. But every evening, when he returned to the empty apartment, he felt the same pain and regret as Grace. Their affair had destroyed everything he had, and now he had to find a way to survive in a new world full of disappointments and losses. It had been several months since the exposure, and both were still unable to fully recover. Grace began to avoid any contact with Malik, realizing that their communication only increases her suffering. She couldn't look at him without pain, realizing that both of them had caused so much pain to other people. One day Grace decided that they needed to meet one last time to finally put an end to their relationship. They met in the park where it all started. It was a quiet, secluded place where no one could see their conversation. Both came here with heavy hearts, knowing that this would be their last conversation.
Malik, I came here to end this forever. We can't communicate anymore. It only brings us pain.
She spoke calmly, but there was an inner tension in her voice. Grace understood that their relationship could no longer be saved, and that they both needed to move on.
I understand, Grace. We have to stop this. This is wrong, and we both know it. We've ruined too many lives.
His words were full of bitterness, but he also realized that it was pointless to continue this path. Their relationship became toxic, and each of them felt that this was the end. They exchanged the last words, and that was the end of their relationship. Grace left, feeling that now she was alone, and she would have to live with the consequences of her actions. Malik also understood that their affair had left deep scars that would never heal. From that moment on, each of them began their journey to healing. Grace, realizing the depth of her mistake, tried to restore at least part of her life, but realized that it was impossible to bring back the past. She needed to start over, even though she didn't know how to do it. Malik, feeling destroyed, was also looking for ways to fix his life. He understood that he had a long road to recovery ahead of him, and that path would be full of pain and regrets. Life, after exposure, was a hard lesson for both of them. They realized that their actions had consequences that they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. After the revelation of the affair with Malik, Grace's life plunged into chaos. Her world, which once seemed so stable and predictable, collapsed overnight. Every day reminded her of what she had lost: family, love, respect and trust. Now her house, once a symbol of peace and security, had become a place where silence echoed inside her, reminding her of the betrayal she had committed. Grace had been feeling heavy since morning. She could barely get out of bed, as each new day brought nothing but pain and disappointment in herself. Every detail in the house reminded her of the happy moments when she, George and Erica were together. The photographs on the walls, the old tea set they took out for family holidays, all this was now a symbol of a ruined past that she would never be able to return. One morning, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, Grace suddenly realized that she couldn't remember the last time she had talked to Erica. The daughter, upon learning about the betrayal, stopped any communication with her. Erica didn't even want to look in her direction, completely severing the contact. Grace knew it wasn't temporary. She understood that by her act she had betrayed not only George, but also her daughter, whose trust she would never be able to restore. Grace's inner world became a battlefield where guilt and despair fought. She knew what she had done, and she knew that what she had done could not be undone, but the guilt was becoming unbearable. Every time she tried to think about the future, her mind kept coming back to the same question: why did I do this? She was sitting in an empty living room, her gaze wandering around the room, filled with memories of happy times. Everything that had once been associated with joy now seemed alien and dead. Silence became her constant companion.
Why didn't I stop? Why did I let this go so far?
She was saying to herself, as if trying to find some excuse for her actions. Every morning was a repetition of the same thing for her. Grace got out of bed, walked around the house, looked at things that no longer brought her comfort, and immersed herself in thinking about what she had destroyed. Her life was now filled with loneliness. George left, and Erica no longer answered her calls and texts. Even the friends who had supported her before now avoided meetings and conversations. One day Grace decided to write a letter to Erica. She sat for a long time in front of an empty sheet, not knowing where to start. Her hands were shaking and her thoughts were confused. She wanted to explain herself, but she knew that no words could justify her action.
Dear Erica, I know that I no longer deserve your trust. I betrayed you and destroyed our family. I'm not looking for forgiveness, because I understand that it may not be. But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I love you and I will always love you. Even if we never see each other again. I just hope that one day you can at least listen to me.
She froze, realizing that her attempts to establish contact with her daughter might not make any sense. But she couldn't just sit back. Her heart was breaking at the thought that Erica would never look at her the way she used to. In the evening, Grace tried to call George again. She needed to hear his voice, at least for a moment. But, like all the previous times, he did not answer. Her messages went unread, and her calls went unanswered. George was gone, and now it seemed that everything that connected them had disappeared forever. One day, her friend Linda came to her, the only one who did not completely turn away from her. Linda, although disappointed by Grace's action, tried to support her, realizing that she was going through a difficult time. Linda, Grace, you can't go on like this. I understand that it's hard for you, but you have to move on with your life. You can't bring back the past, but you can still fix at least part of your life.
How? How can I fix something? I've ruined everything, Linda. George is gone, Erica hates me. How do I move on when everything that mattered is gone?
Her voice was full of despair. Linda knew that words wouldn't help much in such a situation, but she couldn't just stand by.
Grace, you have to start with yourself. You can't bring George back or immediately reconnect with Erica, but you can try to forgive yourself.
Forgive yourself? I don't even know how to do it. I can't forgive myself. Every time I look at my life, I only see mistakes.
Linda sighed and put her hand on Grace's shoulder.
It's a long way, Grace, but you have to start it. Accept what cannot be changed and try to move on. Time does not heal, but it helps to understand that life goes on.
After Linda left, Grace sat alone for a long time, thinking about her words. Forgive yourself, this thought seemed alien to her. How can you forgive yourself for ruining the lives of those you love? How can you find the strength to do this? It's been a few weeks. Grace continued to feel lost. She tried to restore her usual routine, but each time she was faced with the fact that the world around her had changed forever. People who used to respect and love her now avoided her. She had lost her place in society, and now her life had become a series of days filled with despair and regrets. She knew it couldn't go on like this, but she couldn't find the strength to change anything. One day she decided to consult a psychologist, hoping that professional help could help her cope with feelings of guilt and loss. Grace couldn't speak for a long time during the first session. She was sitting in front of the psychologist, nervously fiddling with a handkerchief and looking at the floor. Her inner feelings were so strong that words seemed meaningless to her.
Grace, take your time. I'm here to listen to you. When you're ready, tell me what's bothering you.
Grace took a deep breath and, gathering all her strength, began to speak.
I've ruined everything. I cheated on my husband, betrayed my daughter, and now I do not know how to live on. I just can't forgive myself.
Her voice was trembling. She could barely control herself.
This is a great recognition, Grace. Admitting your mistakes is the first step on the path to healing. But forgiving yourself is a long process. Are you ready for this?
I don't know. I want to change my life, but I don't know how to do it.
The psychologist nodded, showing patience and understanding.
Let's start small. Take a step every day to let go of your past mistakes. It won't be easy, but in time you will be able to find peace. Let's start with a simple one. What could you do for yourself today to feel a little better?
Grace didn't know how to answer that question. She was used to living with constant guilt, and the idea that she could afford to feel even a little relief seemed strange to her.
I don't know. Maybe take a walk in the park? I haven't done this in a long time.
This is a great first step. Start small, and gradually you will see how it helps you move forward.
After the session, Grace actually went to the park. Walking through the quiet alleys, she felt a little lighter, although the pain and guilt still remained. But something has changed. Her steps seemed more confident, and she realized that maybe Linda and the psychologist were right. The healing process is long, but it is possible. Grace knew that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to restore relations with George and Erica. But now she realized that she needed to start with herself, learn to forgive herself for past mistakes in order to move on. Her life will never be the same, but she could find the strength to build a new future, despite the ruined past. After the truth about his affair with Grace surfaced, Malik found himself in a situation he could not have foreseen. In an instant, he lost everything that was dear to him: his wife, friends, the respect of colleagues, and most importantly, the trust of people who once considered him a worthy person. His life, which seemed stable and understandable, collapsed like a house of cards. The feeling of betrayal, not only from those who turned away from him, but also from his own betrayal towards himself, became an unbearable burden that he could not get rid of. Erica, his wife, was the first to leave. As soon as she found out about his infidelity, she packed up and left their shared house. Her eyes, full of pain and disappointment, haunted Malik every time he was alone. She did not make scandals, did not shout or demand explanations. Her silence was the worst punishment for him. She just left, and this departure of hers was proof for Malik that he had lost her trust and love forever. Every day after she left, the emptiness in the house became more noticeable. Their apartment together, once full of life and laughter, has now turned into a silent space filled only with memories of what happened and a sense of inescapable guilt. Every item, their shared photos, her books on the shelves, even her favorite cup, became a reminder of what he had destroyed. Malik walked around the rooms, restless, his thoughts returning to the same thing: how could I let this happen? However, the hardest test for Malik was the realization that his actions not only hurt Erica, but also made him an outcast in the eyes of others. His friends, with whom he had been in contact for many years, no longer wanted to deal with him. One by one, they began to move away. Someone openly declared their disappointment, and someone simply stopped responding to his calls and messages. Malik, who always believed that he would be supported in difficult moments, found himself alone with his problems. He realized that betrayal destroys not only relationships with loved ones, but also the respect that was so difficult to win throughout his life. At work, too, everything has become different. His colleagues, who had always respected him for his professionalism and responsibility, began to look at him with disbelief. It seemed that his every step was now being evaluated through the prism of his personal life. There were no more friendly conversations in the office that he was used to. There was more and more tension, and his presence began to cause awkwardness. Malik felt that he had become an outsider among those with whom he had once worked shoulder to shoulder. Every evening he returned home to an empty apartment, where only silence and loneliness awaited him. He tried to distract himself by immersing himself in work or watching movies, but it didn't bring relief. There was a void inside him that nothing could fill. Malik understood that his life would never be the same again. He began to think that the affair with Grace was not only a mistake, but also an indicator of his own weakness. At the moment when it all started, he felt tired of everyday life, looking for something new that could light a fire in his life. However, instead, he destroyed everything that was really valuable to him. Malik realized that his search for passion and adventure had led to a complete loss of meaning in life. In his attempts to find something new and exciting, he destroyed everything that was really important. At first, he tried to justify himself to himself, To look for explanations for his actions, I was unhappy, my feelings were real. I couldn't do it any other way. But the more he thought about it, the more clearly he realized that these were just excuses. The real reason was that he couldn't cope with himself, with his desires and weaknesses. Malik ruined his life because of his own inability to control his impulses. His internal crisis was growing every day. Malik was plunging into a state of deep depression, feeling that he was losing control of his life. All his usual sources of support, family, friends, work, were no longer available. He tried to return to normal life, but each time he was overtaken by the realization that the old normality no longer exists. Malik could find no solace in anything, and his days became an endless repetition of the same thing: guilt, shame, and despair. Periodically, he thought about leaving, starting over with a clean slate in another city, away from the place where everyone knew about his mistake. But he knew that running away would not solve his problem. He could change his place of residence, but he could not escape from himself, from his thoughts and feelings. Moving would not have relieved him of the burden of knowing that he had betrayed everyone he cared about. One day, Malik decided that he had to somehow try to rebuild at least part of his life. He began to look for ways to drown out his guilt and start over. It seemed to him that if he began to devote more time to work, it would help to distract himself. But here, too, he was going to fail. Work assignments that had previously been a source of satisfaction for him now seemed meaningless to him. He could no longer enjoy what he was doing. Malik realized that his inner world had become empty, and nothing that used to bring joy could save him anymore. He also realized that it would be impossible to restore relations with Erica, even partially. She no longer answered his calls and texts, and he knew that she was gone from his life forever. That thought hurt him the most. Erica was not just a wife for him, she was his best friend, the person with whom he shared all his dreams and plans for the future. The loss of her trust and love left an indelible wound in his heart. Every day Malik became more and more withdrawn into himself. He stopped looking for contacts with others, avoided meetings with colleagues and friends. His social life, once so active and intense, has become completely isolated. He was in a state where every new day seemed unbearably long and meaningless to him. His inner world was destroyed, and Malik did not know how to regain his former confidence and calmness. Malik often thought about how things might have been if he hadn't started this affair with Grace. If he had stopped in time, if he had realized what it would lead to. But each time these thoughts brought him back to the same thing, to the realization that the mistakes he had made could not be corrected. He had lost too much, and now he had to live with it for the rest of his life. One such day, sitting in his empty apartment, Malik realized that he could no longer continue to live like this. He decided to seek help from a psychologist, hoping that this would at least partially help him cope with his inner demons. He knew that he would not be able to return to his old life, but perhaps he could learn to live with the consequences caused by his actions. The first visit to the psychologist was difficult for Malik. It was difficult for him to talk about his feelings and openly admit that he had ruined his life because of weakness. But as the sessions continued, he began to realize that his downfall was not only a consequence of his actions, but also his inability to deal with internal conflicts. Malik began to slowly, step by step, figure out his motives and realize that in order to move on, he needed to take responsibility for his mistakes. The healing process turned out to be long and painful. Malik could no longer get back what he had lost, but he began to look for ways to live with it. Over time, he realized that recovery requires not only time, but also forgiveness, not only from those he betrayed, but also from himself. His life remained lonely and empty, but now he knew that he had to learn to live with it, to cope with inner emptiness and regrets in order to find at least some hope for the future. After months filled with tension, guilt and bitterness, Grace and Malik finally realized that their romance, which once seemed passionate and exciting, has become a destructive force in their lives. Initially, their relationship brought both a sense of novelty, passion, and even some temporary solace from reality, but over time it became clear that their relationship had destroyed everything they had ever valued. Now that the passion had faded, there were only bitter consequences that they both had to deal with. Grace became more and more depressed, and every day she saw more and more clearly that her relationship with Malik had led to the complete collapse of her life. She lost her family, her husband George and daughter Erica, who were the most important things in her life. A marriage that, although it had lost its passion, was still a pillar and stability for Grace. Her role as a mother also disappeared along with her daughter's trust and respect. The guilt of destroying their lives haunted her everywhere. Every day she realized that her relationship with Malik, which began as an attempt to regain lost emotions and intimacy, became a source of only pain and loss. Malik was going through a similar condition. His marriage to Erica was ruined, and now he was forced to live in an empty apartment, feeling lonely and lost. He realized that his affair with Grace was nothing more than an illusion, an attempt to escape from the problems in his own marriage. Their relationship was not built on love or mutual understanding. It was an escape from reality, which eventually turned into a disaster for everyone. Malik also realized that continuing this relationship would only increase his and Grace's suffering. One day they met to talk. They both knew that this conversation was inevitable. Their affair brought them to a point where further continuation of the relationship would be pointless and harmful for each of them. They no longer felt the passion and attraction that had bound them earlier. Instead, the heavy burden of responsibility for destroyed families and lives fell on their shoulders. Their communication became strained, and every time they met, a feeling of inner emptiness grew between them. As they sat at a table in a quiet cafe, their faces were serious and their gazes avoided each other. Both understood that today they had to part forever. Malik, realizing that their romance had long since lost its meaning, took the floor first. He told Grace that the continuation of their relationship would only be a continuation of suffering and suggested that they separate. He felt that their bond would bring them nothing but pain, and that the best thing they could do was let each other go and try to rebuild their lives separately. Grace nodded in silent agreement. She had long understood that their relationship had reached an impasse. When they first started their romance, she thought it would bring her a sense of life that she had missed so much in her marriage to George. But now all she felt was regret and pain. There was no room for romance in her heart anymore, and she knew that a breakup with Malik was inevitable. Their conversation was short and devoid of emotion. Everything has been said before both pain and disappointment. Both were aware that they had ruined other people's lives, and it left deep scars. They didn't need to discuss the details anymore. There was no point in accusations or attempts to justify their actions. They were both guilty, and their guilt bound them more than passion had ever bound them. At some point, Grace felt that the conversation was over and got up from the table. She looked at Malik one last time and felt strangely relieved. It was not a farewell to love, but a farewell to the source of suffering. Her feelings for Malika had long since disappeared, and it was now clear to her that their relationship had been a devastating mistake. She wanted to get rid of that past and try to start over, even if she didn't know how to do it. Malik was also ready to leave. He no longer saw any point in continuing to meet with Grace, because every conversation they had only reminded him of his betrayal and mistakes. He wanted to rebuild his life as much as possible, and he understood that this could only be done on his own. Malik felt it was time to move on, even though he still had a long way to go to heal. When they parted, each went his own way without looking back. It was their last goodbye, and they both knew that their relationship would forever be in the past. There was no need to try to understand each other or make excuses anymore. Their romance was over, and now each of them had to find a way to survive in the world they had destroyed themselves. For Grace, it meant the beginning of a long road to self-forgiveness. Her inner world was destroyed, and every day she faced the memories of what she had lost. She couldn't go back to her old life anymore, and now she had to find a way to live with the guilt and try to rebuild her soul. She knew that it would be almost impossible to restore relations with George and Erica, but she also understood that the only way to move on was to accept her mistakes and try to correct their consequences. Malik, having broken off his relationship with Grace, plunged into thoughts about his life. He realized that his desire for novelty and excitement had led him to completely destroy his world. He could no longer count on Erica's support or friends, and this left him completely isolated. But Malik also understood that now he needed to move on, even if it would be difficult. He decided to start by regaining at least some of his lost dignity and start building his life anew. Over time, they both started moving in their new directions, but their paths no longer crossed. Grace started working on herself, trying to find ways to deal with depression and guilt. She started going to a psychologist, trying to sort out her emotions and understand how she could have made such a mistake. She still had a lot to go through, but she was determined to start a new life, even without the support of those who were dear to her. Malik found the strength to return to work and tried to build a new life on the ruins of the old one. He moved to another city, hoping that it would help him forget about the past and start over. But even in a new place, his memories of what he had lost haunted him. He understood that the path to healing would be long and thorny, but he knew that this was the only way to regain at least some sense of inner peace. As time went on, Grace and Malik continued to go their separate ways. They did not meet again and did not try to reconnect. Their romance is a thing of the past, as a painful reminder that passion and desire can destroy lives if not controlled. Each of them learned their lessons from this experience, and although their path to recovery was different, they both realized that the only way out of this chaos was to accept their mistakes and move forward. Now they had to live with the consequences of their actions, but they were no longer connected to each other. Each of them began the healing process, realizing that the path to forgiveness is not an instant decision, but a long and difficult process that takes time and effort. Their stories intertwined only for a short moment, but this moment changed their lives forever. Grace had never thought that she would ever find herself at such a depth of despair. Every morning became a struggle for her, in which she tried to find at least some support in her life, which turned into chaos. Her feelings, guilt, shame, and loss engulfed her like a huge wave, leaving only ruins in its wake. Her inner world was destroyed, and the only thing left was to try to find a way to heal, at least for herself. She knew she couldn't win George back or restore Erica's trust, but she needed to start the process of self-forgiveness in order to learn how to live again. Grace has always been a person who is used to solving problems on her own, but now she realized that it was no longer possible. She was broken by her actions and their consequences. One day, realizing that it couldn't go on like this, she decided to seek professional help. She needed to deal with her emotions, with why she had committed such a destructive act, and how she could live with it further. The first steps were especially difficult. Grace had a hard time deciding to call a psychologist, but she felt that this was the only way out. She knew she had a long and painful process ahead of her, but she was willing to go through with it. In the first session, she felt vulnerable and helpless. It seemed to her that she was opening up to a stranger the darkest corners of her soul, which she herself did not fully realize. The psychologist Grace started working with was attentive and patient. He understood that the healing process would take a long time and that it was important for Grace to gradually sort out her feelings. The first sessions were dedicated to Grace being able to talk openly about what happened. She talked about her marriage, how she felt lost and lonely in recent years, and how her affair with Malik, which seemed to her a temporary consolation, eventually led to the complete destruction of her life. Grace found it hard to accept the fact that she needed to forgive herself. Her guilt was so deep that she couldn't see how she could live with it anymore. The psychologist helped her understand that forgiving herself does not mean justifying her actions, but rather acknowledging that she made a mistake, and that, despite this, she deserves the opportunity to move forward. This process was difficult and painful, but gradually Grace began to realize that her life was not over, and that she needed to learn to live with the consequences of her actions. Each new session brought new realizations. Grace began to realize that her affair with Malik was the result of her own dissatisfaction and insecurity. She was looking for in this relationship what she lacked in her marriage to George: attention, recognition, and emotional connection. But instead of solving these problems in marriage, she chose a path that led to the destruction of everything she valued. One of the most painful topics for Grace was the loss of communication with her daughter. Erica, after learning about her mother's infidelity, completely broke off all relations with her. This was the biggest blow for Grace. She realized that she had betrayed her daughter's trust, that she had destroyed their bond, which she thought was unbreakable. Erica was her pride and joy, and now she couldn't even see her or talk to her. After several months of working with a psychologist, Grace decided that she should at least try to establish a relationship with Erica. She understood that it would be difficult and that her daughter might never forgive her, but she couldn't leave everything as it was. The psychologist suggested that she write Erica a letter in which Grace could express her feelings, her remorse and apologies. This step seemed frightening to her, but necessary. Gathering her thoughts, Grace began to write a letter several times, but each time she erased what she had written. It was difficult for her to find words that could express the depth of her remorse. She knew that no amount of words could win back Erica's trust, but she still hoped that her frankness and sincerity could at least ease their breakup a little. Finally, Grace wrote a letter in which she honestly admitted her mistakes and expressed her love for Erica. She didn't apologize, knowing that it might be too much, but she hoped that Erica would at least read it and understand what she was going through. Grace sent the letter and waited, at least for a reply, although she was not sure that she would receive it. Meanwhile, Malik was also trying to find his way to healing. After the breakdown of his marriage with Erica, he realized that he needed to radically change his life. He could no longer stay in the same city, among the same people who knew its history. Every corner, every street reminded him of his mistakes, and it became unbearable for him. He decided to move to another city, hoping that a new place and a new job would help him start from scratch. The move was his attempt to put the past behind him, although Malik understood that he would not be able to escape from his internal problems. He knew that he needed time to sort himself out and his actions, but he also understood that in a new place he would have a chance to restore his self-esteem. The new city greeted Malik coolly. He didn't know anyone, and that initially gave him a sense of freedom. No one knew his past, his mistakes, his betrayal. But it also meant that he would have to rebuild his life, which turned out to be more difficult than he thought. Malik hoped that work would help him distract himself, but every evening, returning to an empty apartment, he again faced loneliness and inner demons. Over time, Malik began to realize that the move itself would not solve his problems. He still felt guilty for what he had done, and this feeling did not disappear despite the change in the situation. He also knew that he had to work on himself to find a way to move on. Like Grace, he began seeing a psychologist, realizing that he needed professional help to cope with an internal crisis. Malik realized that his affair with Grace was the result of his own unfulfilled desire to avoid problems in his marriage with Erica. He sought solace on the side instead of working on his relationship. But now that everything was destroyed, he had to face the consequences of his actions and try to figure himself out. With each session, he became more aware that healing would be a long and difficult process. Malik knew he needed to forgive himself, but as with Grace, it wasn't easy. He began to analyze his mistakes and realize that his actions were not only the result of his dissatisfaction, but also weakness, inability to take responsibility for his life. Over time, Malik began to regain his sense of inner balance. He found a job that gave him stability and began to settle in a new city. But he knew that his path to full healing was far from over. Forgiving himself and accepting his mistakes became his main challenge, and every day he tried to take a step towards it. As time passed, Grace and Malik gradually began to find ways to live with the consequences of their actions. Each of them chose their own path to healing Grace through self-forgiveness and attempts to establish a relationship with her daughter, Malik through moving and inner work on themselves. Their lives had changed forever, but they both knew that moving forward was the only way to deal with what had happened. Both realized that they would never be able to completely forget about their mistakes, but they also began to realize that life goes on. Every day was a new challenge, and every day they learned to live with the consequences of their actions, gradually finding a way to inner peace. After the devastating end of their relationship, Grace and Malik found themselves on a difficult and long road to recovery. Their lives, completely changed because of the mistakes they made, required conscious efforts in order to move on. Each of them plunged into a deep internal crisis, realizing that they would not be able to return to their former lives. But over time, they began to find ways to deal with the guilt and try to rebuild their lives. Grace, who lost everything, family, friends, trust and respect from others, began her journey to healing through gradual acceptance of her mistakes. She continued to visit a psychologist, dealing with her emotions, learning to understand why she went on a destructive affair with Malik. At first it seemed to her that she would never be able to recover, and that the life she knew was gone forever. But over time, Grace began to realize that her life wasn't over, she just became different. Her first realization was that forgiving herself is not a quick process. It required constant effort and patience. The guilt, like a heavy load, did not go away immediately. Even when she thought she had found some peace, her consciousness brought her back to what had happened. Every time she passed by the old house where she lived with George and Erica, she felt her heart tighten with pain and regret. She knew that she had destroyed it all with her own hands, and she needed to accept it in order to move on. Over time, Grace realized that the past cannot be brought back, but she can learn to live with the consequences of her actions. She focused on rebuilding her life. Her first task was to establish a daily routine, to return to the work that had once brought her satisfaction. Although colleagues and acquaintances initially treated her with distrust, Grace gradually began to restore her professional relationships. She focused on her work, which helped her find a foothold in the new reality. One of the most difficult tasks for Grace remained her relationship with her daughter Erica. After Grace wrote her a letter of apology and revelation, there was no response. This made her feelings even worse, but she understood that Erica had every right not to forgive her. Inside, Grace continued to hope that one day, perhaps, they would be able to talk and try to restore at least some of the lost relationship. But she also realized that it would only happen when Erica was ready for it. It took several years before Grace was able to come to some kind of inner peace. She learned to live with the consequences of her actions, accepted that part of her life was lost forever, but that didn't mean she couldn't build a future anymore. She started doing charity work, helping women who were going through family crises, which gave her a sense of importance and usefulness. These new activities helped her find a new meaning in her life, and although the pain and regrets of the past still remained with her, she learned not to let them rule her life. Malik, like Grace, also went through a deep internal struggle. When he moved to a new city, he hoped to leave everything behind, but he quickly realized that the past always follows you. Despite the new living conditions, his internal crisis did not resolve itself. The move gave him space to think, but it didn't get rid of his feelings of guilt and loss. Malik, like Grace, started seeing a psychologist. During therapy, he realized that his affair with Grace was not only the result of a temporary passion, but also an attempt to escape from the underlying problems in his marriage with Erica and his own insecurity. He often came back to thinking about what he might have done differently if he had paid attention to the signals that were obvious long before he began to seek solace on the side. Malik realized that he had to be honest with himself and Erica from the very beginning, so as not to bring everything to such a catastrophe. The process of self-forgiveness was difficult for Malik. Every time he thought about Erica and the moment when she found out about the betrayal, he was overcome with deep longing. He understood that he had lost the woman he loved because of his weakness, and he knew that he would never be able to regain her trust again. But over time, thanks to the support of a psychologist and his own reflections, Malik began to understand that forgiving himself is not forgetting mistakes, but accepting that he is a human being and that all people make mistakes. Malik found solace in work and new beginnings. He started doing sports and meditation, which helped him find balance and inner peace. Gradually, his life began to take on a new shape, although the memories of the past did not leave him. He also tried to build new relationships. Although each time it was difficult for him, the fear of repeating his mistakes haunted him. But Malik realized that each new step was important for his healing. It took several years before Malik felt that he could start his life anew. He did not forget about his mistakes, but he learned to live with them. He understood that his past would always be a part of him, but that shouldn't stop him from building a future. Malik began to spend more time communicating with new friends, opening up to people, although it required a lot of effort from him. He learned anew to trust and be honest with himself and others. For Malik, this process was even more difficult because of the loss of respect from friends and colleagues who had once been a part of his life. In the new city, he tried to build new social connections, but past mistakes left a deep mark on his soul. Nevertheless, over time, he found his place in a new environment and began to appreciate the lessons he learned from his mistakes. As a result, both Grace and Malik went through years of pain, introspection, and recovery. They both realized that their affair was a mistake that led to the destruction of their lives and the lives of those who were dear to them. But they also realized that this experience helped them get to know themselves, their weaknesses, and their motives better. This hard path has taught them responsibility and the need to be honest both with themselves and with others. And although their paths no longer crossed, they both learned to live with what happened. Grace has rebuilt a part of her life, finding new meanings in helping others and working on herself. Malik found peace in his new hobbies and social life, gradually accepting himself and his mistakes. Now, years after the end of their relationship, they could look back with the realization that their lives had changed forever, but that this change was a lesson for them and an opportunity to start over. They were no longer the people who had once allowed emotions to ruin their lives. Now each of them was stronger, wiser, and ready to build a new life this time with an understanding of their weaknesses and responsibility for their actions.